right, moving into the main meat and potatoes of my episode today, I'll be discussing the top 10 free agents moving into next year, and I'll also be discussing the 10 best transfers for me so far. So this is premature. There's obviously a lot of the transfer window to go, but I thought I would just address it halfway because it's interesting because, after Origin, this is where we sort of not start to look to next year, but a lot of the teams down the bottom of the ladder start to look at how they can improve for next year. I think there's still time. I think you can actually sign up to August this year, mid-season top-up, so maybe these players are relevant for the big clubs as well. So honourable mentions go to Edric Lee. Still think he has the potential to be a very, very good winger if he played for a good club or a centre, whichever position he plays. He's a big, tall player. Struggled with injury this year. Not sure if he's going to play in the back end for the Knights. Nari Tuwala, only 22 years old. I think he's a pretty serviceable centre for the Knights. Doesn't get much traction, but I think he's a solid player. Curtis Cyranon sort of lost his position at Manly. He started the season injured. Schuster seems to have taken his role there, and they've got Ola Kawatu and Lawton now, rotating through that back row. So it looks like Ciro's time at Manly could be up, but there was a period a couple of years ago where he wasn't too far off the New South Wales selection, and he's not the youngest player now, but I think he would still do a pretty serviceable role for the next few years. Mitch Kenny, young hooker at Penrith, not going to get much game time at Penrith if Coruscant stays there, and Coruscant's still got a few years ahead of him, so he's played a lot of games this year, so they might be interested in keeping him as a backup, but there's teams like the Bulldogs and stuff who don't really have a hooker, so a well-renowned hooker. So if Mitch Kenny could get some more game time there. Ray Stone is also someone else who we haven't seen too much of him really. He's sort of been in and out of that Parramatta bench. He's dealt with a few injuries and suspensions and stuff, but whenever I've watched him, I thought he's been a really impactful player off the bench. He's not too young. I think he's 24, but I think at the right club, he could be a dangerous player, whether it be off the bench or starting. He seems to bring a lot of energy and passion to the game. All right, now time for my top 10. I've weighed ages into this pretty heavily because, well, to me anyway, I know it's a little bit different because if you're signing them on a 2-year contract or something, it doesn't matter if they're 21 or 27, you're still going to get them in their prime. You're not signing them for the rest of their career, but I have weighted that into it because, you can sign a 23-year-old for a 6-year contract where you're not going to sign a 29-year-old for a 6-year contract. So I have weighed that into it. I've also weighed in a lot of stuff, really. So let's get into it. Number 10, I've got Tyrone May, 25 years old. He can play any position, really, and that's what makes him an interesting prospect. He is a natural half, you'd have to say, but he's played hooker, he's played centre, he's played back row. He's spent a few years at that Penrith elite system now. He's obviously been there since a junior, but he's been there since they've become elite. So he's obviously been very well trained, but he's not really going to get a starting spot in that team, is he? So unless they see him as a centre in the future, and when Burton leaves, he's going to play centres. I think he could be an interesting gamble for a team, and it is exactly that. It's a gamble. We haven't really seen him start week in, week out. When he started in the Origin period, when Luai and Cleary went there, he didn't dominate, but he's got the talent, and he could be an interesting pickup if a team want to take a risk on a player, especially now with the trend in, smaller players playing in the middle. He could play as a 14. He could very well and truly do it like a Connor Watson-esque role. Number 9, I've got Billy Smith. I didn't realise this, but he played his first game last week in ages. I think he's done a couple knees and stuff. He's only 21, but I remember, I think he might have been 18 or 19 at the time. He kind of burst onto the scene at the Roosters, and he was a really exciting prospect. I remember every time he played, he really impressed me, and I think he scored a try last week on his return. So he's going to be someone to watch for the rest of the year, especially now that Swali's out for the season. Smith is all but locked up one of those centre spots. Actually, that could be a lie because it could be Josh Morris and Joey Manu, but with injuries and stuff, he's going to more than likely get a fair few cracks at it. So he's going to be one to watch. I think he could be a very, very interesting player for a lower club to pick. I don't think he would demand much wages, and I think he has this bright future in the game, especially right now, where there doesn't seem to be too many centres going around. A lot of the centres playing in the Origin Arena and international game aren't actually centres, so I'd be surprised if someone didn't snap him up pretty quick, especially a player coming out of the Roosters. Number 8, I got Tex Hoy. He's only 21. He had big raps last year, but I have to say he has not lit the world on fire, and it's a game built for fullbacks. So if you come into the competition and you don't really have an impact on games as a fullback, you're probably not the greatest player. Like, that's pretty savage for me to say, but he's only 21 and is a skillful player. So I would be surprised if someone didn't take a risk on him, even if it's just for development. Next, I got Tyron Peachey on the other end of the age scale. He's 29, but I do think in the last 2 or 3 years he's played some of his best footy at the Titans. They've really found his role as a bit of a lock middle forward, but he doesn't seem needed there anymore. They've signed Isaac Liu, who's likely going to play lock, and they probably want to shore up their defence a little bit, so maybe they question his defence. But if he could go to a bigger club who just needs a bit more creativity out of that lock position, he could be the perfect candidate. Number 6, I got Dill Walker, 26 years old, bit of a resurgence this year in his career. At the start of the season, he wasn't having much impact at fullback. He looked really out of place, but since his return from injury, he's had a couple games at halfback. He's come in a middle forward position off the bench, and he's been electric. So he's shown that he still has a lot to give in his NRL career, and I think a lot of clubs would be very, very happy to add him to the books, only 26 years old. Next, I've got Ash Taylor, 26 years old. Interested to see what the Titans do here. They do really like Tanner Boyd, and you would think they're going to stick with Jamal Fogarty at halfback for a few years to come, but they haven't re-signed Ash Taylor yet, and they have signed a lot of players, so I'm not sure how much salary cap they have to spend. Maybe they see the future is Brimson at 6 and Jaden Campbell at fullback, which would be an interesting move. But it doesn't look like Ash Taylor's future is at the Titans, and I think he's an interesting player. I think a big club like the Roosters or something, I know they've got Sam Walker coming in, and they've got Luke Keary, so maybe there's not a spot for him there, but a team like the Roosters where the rest of the team is pretty set up, but they just could use a bit of an icing on the cake. So he's an interesting player. A bit of a gamble, would probably need a fairly decent salary, which isn't ideal for a gamble, but I think he's an interesting prospect. Number 4, this would definitely be a pot of an opinion. I don't think many people would share this with me, but I've got Tessie New in at number 4, only 19 years old, and he's already played pretty much a season and a half of first grade. He's only recently starting to show the ability that he has. He's always had high raps, but his defense, especially in the centers, came into question on a lot of occasions, but he's played fullback the last 3 or 4 games, and he's looked really, really good. He's shown a creative ability ever since his debut in the top grades, and the Broncos have basically shown their faith in him. They've picked him over Sarko. They basically told Walsh that he's free to go. He's not going to get a game in first grade, and this was all with Tessie New in the background. And I know there's obviously other factors behind it, but that obviously shows the level that they rate Tessie New. And the fact that they haven't re-signed him is very interesting, because maybe they don't rate him that much. Maybe I've just contradicted myself. But if I was a big club, maybe with the room, for a development spot in that number 30, I would happily jump on him. Or even if I was a lower club, because I don't think he's going to demand much money unless he tears up the back half of this year. And he's only 19. So I think Tessie New is a very, very interesting prospect. Number 3, I've got Dane Gagai, and he's 30, but I think he's playing some of the best footy of his career. I think this year he's been really, really good for the Rabbitohs. He was still pretty good for Queensland in Origin, and if he can go another 3 or 4 years, I think he could be a really, really solid player for a team that wants him. As I mentioned before, centres is a very in-demand position right now. The centres are always changing year after year. So I think Dane Gagai would be a very, very good pickup by any club, really. Number 2, I've got Dale Finucane, one of the most talked about free agents currently. I think he'd be number 1 for a lot of people, but his age has put him at number 2 for me. He's 29. He's a middle forward, so you could argue that they're going to play less for a shorter amount of time than like an outside back. But he's just a very, very good player. You know what he's going to give you. He's going to give you an 8 out of 10 performance every week. He's going to run 120 metres. He's going to make 30 tackles. He's just a real workman. And yeah, there's not really much else to say for Dale Finucane. Anyone who's a quality player out of the Storm, everyone always wants him, and it's going to be interesting to see where he ends up. Number 1, I've got Jaden Sewer. Probably a rogue opinion, but I really do rate this guy highly. I know he's fallen out of favour at the Rabbitohs in the last few months, but he's only 23. He's played State of Origin. He's arguably one of the best tacklers in the game. He just needs to add a little bit more offensive work rate, you'd have to say. He doesn't do many damaging runs. He's a back rower, so he's not really, he's not going to be charging up the middle of the game, charging up the middle of the ground, making a line break or anything. But you never really see Jaden Sewer getting onto the end of a flat ball, bursting through a hole, that sort of thing. So that's maybe something he can look to add on his game. But someone with a perfect tackling technique, only 23, already played Origin. He's been coached by Wayne Bennett, one of the greatest coaches of all time. I would be snapping Jaden Sewer up right now. And I think his wage would have taken a serious hit after his recent mission from the Rabbitohs team. So here's my number 1 free agent at the moment. So I'm going to be interested to see where he goes. Obviously linked to the Dragons, I think it is. So it'll be interesting to see where he ends up, same as the rest of the 10 on that list.
It's a miracle! Oh, yeah! What about that one? Unbelievable! Balotelli, Aguero! Crowd cheers. Here's Siddle.